Good afternoon. Hi, this is Eric Settle, and welcome to episode 8 of Pinot and Policy. It is April the what's the
17th.
April 17th, 2025. We've been away for a month. I apologize to our fans who have bated waited for the next episode,
I got a lot
but
of fan mail, Eric. A lot of fan mail saying what's going on. When are you guys putting out the next episode?
right, I heard that, and so we're back. And so an update, career update on me. I joined the law firm a month ago, Royer Cooper, Cohen and Braunfeld. I'm senior counsel involved in healthcare, and so what we're going to talk about today are my personal views and not the views of Royer Cooper, Cohen and Braunfeld LLC.
I like that. It sets the table for us nicely. So other than your fresh new employment, Eric, there's been a lot going on in the world since our last episode. No shortage of content for us to cover. So uh, before we dive into one of them, why don't you give our listeners and viewers a quick little overview of the topics we're going to get into on this episode?
Sure, we're going to talk about. We're going to talk a little bit about what's going on with what's happened in the last month. So we're going to talk about tariffs and the global economy. We're going to talk a little bit about what's going on in Gaza and Ukraine. We're going to talk about the attacks on the law firms and the court system. And then we're going to talk about the attack on the governor's mansion in Pennsylvania. That's very personal for me because, as some of you know, I worked for Governor Tom Ridge and had the privilege of spending a lot of time in that building. And so it is both, as someone who's Jewish, it's both offensive to see an attack like this that does seem to be motivated by anti Semitism, but also just the clear fact that there's a beautiful building in Harrisburg that has been not destroyed but seriously damaged. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about the Phillies DA race, which is involving people locally. So let's get started.
Awesome. And just a reminder, Pinot and Policy, our hope is to have civil discourse on what at times can be contentious topics so that we can better understand varying perspectives in the US and our world. So without further ado, let's get into it, Eric. What do we
All
say?
right, so let's talk about. I mean, I guess we'll talk. I think about a month ago, the tariff issue was just beginning, and the president was announcing he was going to be imposing tariffs on all sorts of countries. And since then, we've had what is affectionately referred to as Liberation Day, where he announced major tariffs on all countries in the world, including countries that don't have anybody in them, including the Herd Islands that apparently are simply occupied by penguins.
Well, the Penguins could be making a lot of stuff. They could be flooding the markets. They could be really like flooding the US market with I don't
Sardines.
wasn't there a time, what was it? What was it, like guano, where there was like some kind of bird poop that was actually turned into energy, and there was an island that the US wanted to have access to, and literally it was causing issues in the economy. But we'll save that for another time. Maybe
So anyway,
thinking of,
so
I don't know. I don't know. It could have been.
president announces tariffs. The market continues to go down.
Yeah.
It continues to go down, and then he pauses the tariffs and goes within one day where he says, "I'm not going to make any changes." To he puts all those tariffs on pause, except for the tariffs on China. And now what we have with China is a really a full-on trade war because the Chinese government and the the Chinese government is a strong economic player in the world, and they feel like they have the ability to withstand the actions of the President of the United States. Other countries obviously do not feel the same way and have been negotiating to try to reach new deals. And I will tell you honestly that at the end of the day, it may lead to better trade between us and our major trading partners like Canada and Mexico and Europe. But China is also a major trading partner, and this is going to be a problem.
Yeah. So there are a lot of people who have the belief, economists, not just like, I'm not just talking about a populist perspective here, but there are a lot of economists who have the belief that the that world trade, that the idea of having a globalist economy is something that was going to be unwound anyway, regardless of the tariffs being the catalyst to say, well, now it's official. Now, like, China and the US are uncoupling or decoupling. There are a lot of people who believe that was going to happen anyway. So you might as well do it on one's own terms, and get into that process, because it world trade was already on, like, since 2020, world trade was already going to be unwound, and this is just part of that process.
I mean, I suppose, but the fact of the matter is we have a global economy. And look, the president's goal to bring back manufacturing to the United States is a laudable one. I mean, certainly we all have been around our country and seen, cities that used to be great manufacturing centers that no longer can do that. But the question is can you roll back the clock 100 years, which is what these tariffs that are similar to what was imposed in the 1920s, is happening. And I just don't know if that's possible. And to the extent it is possible, it just seems like there's not a clear plan on how to do this.
There's a lot of ready, fire, aim, right? So, and it's that environment of uncertainty that is according to most people's belief, the cause of the decline in the stock market right now, right? Businesses, CEOs, and even SMBs, small to medium sized businesses, like to operate and make decisions, especially when it comes to CapEx expenditures. They like to do that in an environment where they can make some type of prediction or understand where the cost of goods are going to be. And right now, they can't do that. So that uncertainty gives a lot of people pause. I think it makes a lot of people think they should be reinvesting elsewhere or not investing at all. So a lot of cash is just leaving the market and moving to the sidelines, or leaving the market. And when I say the market, I'm talking about equities, and as well as investments into other businesses. So instead of businesses making big purchases for CapEx, they're saying, well, we're either going to make less of a purchase or we're not going to make any purchase at all. And then as far as investments go, businesses or investors of all sorts of different types are not investing in US equities. They're looking to, like, the European stock market maybe is benefiting from this. And people, what's even more scary is people are starting to not invest, and there's not as much of a flight to security in US treasuries. Where usually
Right.
when money leaves the stock market with equities, it usually moves to bonds and treasuries. Well, that's not happening right now, which is, Yellen obviously commented on this. I'm sure a lot of people saw her comments, where you're having this, odd decline of, like, you're seeing interest rates actually push up when they should be coming down. It's
Right.
having an inverted effect on where interest rates are, as far as, well, treasuries, as far as, like, where the long end of the treasuries are right now, which, hey, we've got a lot of debt that we need to refinance as a country. So if treasuries, if that goes up, that's only going to make it more expensive for us to refinance our debt.
Well, but the other part here is that
Ramifications.
yeah, a lot of our debt is held by other nations, including China, which is another part. Again, they sort of overlook the fact that China could dump our debt, and that's what had affected the president to pause the major tariffs was a beginning of a collapse in the bond.
Right.
In other words, the stock market is always volatile, but the bond market's pretty consistent. So in the bond market, as he put it, got squirrely. Um, I think that's what moved him, because look, he's a smart guy. He knows what he's doing in some ways, or he knows finance because he's a wealthy person. But it just seems like there's not a plan. And I think your point about certainty. Look, there's already uncertainty in business. You try to make decisions, but you try to have a playing field that makes a little bit of sense.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because yesterday the Jerome Powell, the chairman of the Fed, talked about the fact that they're trying to figure out what they want to do because they're not sure what the effect of these tariffs are going to be, other than an expectation of some inflation, but also an expectation that this may slow the economy. And then we have this new word that was an old word in the 70s during the Carter administration, was stagflation.
You're gonna say the S word. That's a
Yeah.
scary word, right?
No, where
That's
you
a
have
very
both.
scary word. So
Yeah, we have
define that. What is for our viewers? What is the definition?
stagflation is where you have you have prices going up and and the economy slowing down.
So at the same time, there is inflation. So the cost of goods is going up. We all have to pay more out of our pocket. And usually when inflation happens, people are making more money. That's going up together. But in this case, stagflation, wages typically stay the same, which is growth, right? So growth is flat or barely flat, but the cost of goods are increasing at the same time, which is a very dangerous scenario, right? Nobody wants to see that.
Right. So think of it this way. So prices are going up and you lose your job.
Oof.
So now you can't now you really can't afford eggs because you have no salary. I mean, and we haven't seen this environment since the 70s, when energy prices skyrocketed and caused this.
So do you think that is a like, of course it's a possible scenario, but is that a probable scenario? Is that a bit of demagoguery going on by forces on the other side of the aisle that just, want to do everything possible to paint a negative picture on what's going on right now? And while there's danger,
So right, so I hear you. So
right.
let's talk about this. So we know that tariffs will likely increase prices
without
because
without a doubt.
because it essentially making goods more expensive, and that the government there will be money imposed to say, look, if you want to bring in a bottle of Pinot from Burgundy, if it used to be 50, now it's going to be 59 or 60. Okay, so that price is going to get passed along. Now, do we have to have slow growth? We don't. But I think one of the things you're seeing lately with the volatility, and we haven't had a recession in a long time, so we are our business cycle is due for slowing down. And so part of what's so frustrating to many people is that all of the economic uncertainty that has taken place in the last month is really caused by one person's policy decision to take control of the global markets by using tariffs.
Well, and that is, I think, going to be a common thread in all the topics we have. And before we move on to the next topic, to our viewers and our listeners, please let us know what you think about tariffs. Are they a necessary evil? Is this something that was going to happen anyway, as far as unwinding globalization and the bilateral relationship between the U.S. and China? Was this something that was just going to happen anyway, and we might as well get ahead of it? In order to get to the next phase of where the world and the world economy are headed, you got to break a few omelets, or break a few eggs to make an omelet. Or is this the catalyst in what could be a devastating deep recession, stagflation, and maybe even depression? And obviously I'm presenting two extremes, but curious what everybody thinks. And of course, we welcome any nuance in between those two extremes. I do want to share, Eric, I looked it up while we were talking. The U.S. claimed and harvested bird guano from numerous islands in the Pacific and Caribbean with the Guano Islands Act of 1856, allowing citizens to claim uninhabited islands with guano deposits. That's bird poop for all you out there. Some of these islands included Baker Howland, and Jarvis, which are now part of the Pacific Remote Islands Marine National Monument. Just a little fun bit of. So maybe those Penguin Islands have some value.
I
One
stand corrected.
never knows. One never knows.
So,
Anyway,
so
so
let's talk a little bit about. Let's talk a little bit about what's going on with talking about one person's actions. One person thought they could solve the Ukraine war. One person thought they could solve the situation in Gaza. A month later, the bombs are still flying in Ukraine. The Israeli army is back in Gaza. It's just we those of us who have some familiarity with foreign policy know that these are very complicated issues, and they're going to continue to be complicated. And although the president does have a guy named Steve Witkoff who is apparently doing shuttle diplomacy, so far, there's been really very little progress on those two areas where I had hoped, the president could have an impact. But, it's clear that Vladimir Putin doesn't really want to bring this war to an end, but we'll see what happens.
yeah, to continue our use of eggs and metaphors and analogies here, the president got a little egg on his face with some of the comments by Putin, and sending people to have discussions about possible peace talks and ceasefires, and then lo and behold, there's bombs are dropped on a religious date on civilians, killing over 30 people. So I don't think anything that Putin does is by accident, right? This is somebody who is big on messaging and symbolism, and people like to talk about 3D chess. I think Putin fancies himself as always being a few steps ahead. So it's interesting, especially with some of the campaign promises that Trump made, and talking about his ability to end this war pretty quickly.
Pretty quickly, yes.
Right? Here we are. And I think regardless of where anybody is on their political beliefs, I think they want to see bloodshed and wars not happen at all. And if they do, come to an end quickly. So I feel like the president has kind of painted himself into a corner here, right? It's not really good calculus and foreign policy strategy from anybody's perspective.
No, I think it's a recognition that it kind of related it to the discussion about China, which is, look, as much as the United States is one of the most powerful nations in the world, we're not unlimited in our power, and other nations have the ability to create leverage, and we're no better. We're really no better off, and it's a shame because people are suffering. And it's interesting. So I'll make a turn to what happened in Harrisburg this week. The fire at the governor's mansion. Really terrible story, both on a kind of a political level, a personal level. For those who didn't see it, obviously a mentally troubled person who essentially was motivated by Governor Shapiro's support of Israel, firebombed the governor's mansion and causing extensive damage in the residence. And it's a very scary story. And I had the privilege, having worked for Governor Tom Ridge, to have spent a fair amount of time in that building. And the room that got torched is sort of the wing that's the kind of the entertainment wing of the governor's mansion. The family is kind of in the other wing. And luckily, because the doors to the entertainment side of the house were closed, the fire didn't spread too quickly to the residential part of the house, and was kind of contained in the entertainment area. And it's just, the governor had just celebrated a Passover Seder, very symbolic. There have been Jewish governors in Pennsylvania before, but we never had a Jewish governor who is as open about his Jewish faith as Josh Shapiro is. I mean, it's a very meaningful thing for him to be that way. It creates this sort of scary moment, for his family that, we don't really think about this, but obviously, political violence is happening more and more. And he made the point about at the time about, this is just not okay. And he referred back to Butler, PA, here in Pennsylvania, where, someone took a shot at the president.
Yeah, it's scary that two really intense political acts of let's call them what they are, like assassination attempts, happened in our home state of Pennsylvania. Which people, when they hear Pennsylvania, I think a lot of people think of Philadelphia and major historical city, but it's a really big state, and you think of Pittsburgh too, like Steel City, another big state, but there's a lot in between those two cities, and you have to think back to the fact that the southern border of Pennsylvania was on the Mason-Dixon line. There is a deep history of racism in the state, and bigotry, whether that's against African Americans, Jews, other religions. It's a real unfortunate underbelly, and not often viewed part of the state. There are a lot of militias. There were a lot of, maybe still are. I know at one time there were a lot of Ku Klux Klan membership or members in the state. So it's something that hopefully gets rooted out, and maybe this can be a catalyst to look deeper into that for the state. You want to try and think about silver linings when I think, what was it, Eric? 3 Molotov cocktails filled with gasoline, right? Were thrown into the mansion, and when this person was questioned about motives and what they would have done if the governor was there, it said something along the lines of he would have beaten the governor with a hammer.
Right.
And I don't know if that's making reference to the attack on Nancy Pelosi's husband, who was beaten with a hammer. So, and to comment further, beyond Pennsylvania, your observation, which is, I think, very accurate and scary, that there are more acts of political violence that are going on, whether it's the two in Butler, the assassination attempts on Governor Shapiro and President Trump, and then on the other side of the country in California with Nancy Pelosi's husband, or even some of the still very violent, but to lesser degrees than an assassination attempt, but still very violent, like some of the acts of vandalism that are occurring in Tesla, retail shops,
Right.
Tesla.
Right. I mean, we almost made it 25 minutes without saying the name Elon Musk. But right, I agree with you. Like the attacks on Teslas and Tesla dealerships, which is really political violence. I mean, these are people who are protesting the acts of Elon Musk and Doge,
But
which
scary. But so you have Tim Walz, who comes across like this, lovable teddy bear, like high school coach, right? Who you hate to see him like almost like making incendiary remarks to a crowd, talking about how it's great to see the stock of Tesla going down, and again, regardless of where you are politically, you never want to see an American company fail, especially one that impacts so many jobs such as Tesla. But then when these violent acts are occurring, you don't want to have a dog whistle to encourage them.
And that's the problem. The problem is that things are fraying around the edges. I don't know, Rafe. Do you need to remind people who Tim Walz is? I think people have now forgotten.
Yeah, they probably have. And let's actually connect it to Governor Shapiro. So, there was a time when Kamala Harris was trying to figure out who her running mate was going to be, and Shapiro was a front runner, right?
Right.
And she was in Pennsylvania to make the announcement, and everybody was waiting with bated breath and assuming it was going to be Shapiro. And who did she pick?
Tim Walz.
Tim Walz.
I was there. I was there that night. I was there at Temple at the Leacourt Center, and I must tell you, it was fun. It was a great party. Governor Shapiro gave a really nice speech that day, and yeah, I look. I think, and that's what also what's interesting about what's happened in Pennsylvania is, Josh has become a national figure.
He really
He is
has.
someone. He is someone that people are looking to as a likely 2028 presidential candidate. Who, by the way, does try to espouse a centrist view. Because it's interesting. The other thing that's going on right now that's getting a lot of attention is the oligarchy tour, which is Bernie Sanders and AOC,
Yeah.
and I think the biggest issue for the Democratic Party is trying to figure out how do you respond to this? And I think
Right.
I think part of it is I think it's smart, to keep telling the stories of the impacts of these things. I think it's important. We talked. One of the issues that's very hot is related to this Maryland person who is being held in El Salvador, and the fact that the Supreme Court, for 9-0 decision, has told the administration to facilitate the return of Mr. Obrador. And
Yeah, thank heavens for the judiciary branch, right? It's like we've got an executive branch that has like just gone complete rogue, and a legislative branch that's just kind of sitting on the sidelines and watching. But to your point, the judiciary branch is actually acting the way a body of government should be acting in this scenario.
right, and they're acting. I mean, and it's interesting. Over the course of the past month, there have been decisions that have worked their way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court is so. For example, for the folks all the folks sent to Venezuela, the Supreme Court said, "Well, you really." The Supreme Court said you can send people. They actually didn't get to whether the Alien Sedition Act would apply to illegal immigrants. They have to still make that decision. But what they did say was, agreeing with the judge in Washington, is that if you're going to deport people, there needs to be some due process. And when we say due process, some hearing, some tribunal, some way for people to present evidence. It is the fundamental principle of our judicial system and our constitutional system that we just don't haul people out of countries and send them somewhere. And I think the court has tried very hard to try to support that idea, but in a way that, and we're starting to see, the whole issue of, talk about a constitutional crisis, this whole issue of, following court orders. And, the judge in Washington has now begun contempt proceedings against the administration. And so the question there is he's going to likely find that the lawyers and the government did not follow his order, which would make them subject to civil or criminal penalties, including jail. And so you sort of see the question is, well, where does that go? And well, it keeps getting appealed to it'll get appealed to the appeals court and then the Supreme Court. And the question is the Supreme Court going to uphold kind of a contempt citation against, Pam Bondi, the Attorney General of the United States?
Yeah, and see, so this is where I think it's worth commenting on, like the tribalism that we see in our country, of the quote unquote the Trumpers and MAGA, that it's like, well, whatever Trump does, I'm going to back him because I believe in Trump, right? And then you've got this other side of the equation where it's, well, whatever Trump does, I'm going to disagree with it. It's awful, and he's a disgusting person. It's like you get all the character attacks,
Right.
and he can't do anything right, and you're just going to be against it because it came from Trump. Well, what I think is important here, and what I love that you're pointing out, is there is a function of government, right? We have laws, we have a rule of law, and our government's supposed to act a certain way. And we're seeing that play out. And that's kind of what, not kind of, this is what you're touching on here. And it's interesting to see how the varying, attorneys general of the various states are either taking sides or not taking sides. And some of them are being loyal to the party, quote unquote. And some of them, you have some outliers that even though they're with a certain tribe, a certain party, they're taking a stand in a different way. And have you identified any of those?
Yeah, well, so for example, the Supreme Court announced today they are going to take the birthright citizenship case. Now, that case that arose out of an executive order essentially is the president is seeking to end birthright citizenship. And what that is that the basic rule of the Constitution that if you're born in the United States, regardless of the status of your parents, you are an American citizen. And the president would like to revoke that and, stop the possibility or the illegal immigrants coming to America, having a baby, and creating an American citizen that now has, all the rights of an American citizen. This is pretty clear from the Constitution. The 14th Amendment established birthright citizenship. It was established for the purpose of making sure that enslaved Americans would be counted as citizens. That was the original reason for it. But it was reinforced in 1896 by a Chinese immigrant whose child was born in the United States. And so it's really been black letter constitutional law for over 120 years. That case is going to the Supreme Court. And interestingly enough, and that's the case was brought by a number of attorney generals of states, Democratic attorney generals, and is being supported by a whole raft of Republican attorney generals from all these states that are be considered red states, but not Pennsylvania. Dave Sunday, my former opponent for attorney general, who has said he's going to stick to doing the core job of attorney general, has stuck to that, and I respect that. He is making the decision that this is not an issue that he needs to be in. It's an issue where he's probably looking at both sides and saying, I think we're going to stay out of this. But it'll be interesting to see what the Supreme Court does. In the meantime, that principle is still held up. So that you're right. There is you do see some people, and I would argue that Dave is showing a lot of political courage and is probably getting a little bit of crap from his fellow Republican AGs who are going, why are you not with us?
Well, yeah, you know what? Good for Dave. I had the pleasure of meeting him too at I get what was it? Kind of a debate that you guys were.
Yeah, it was the Pittsburgh Forum.
Yeah, that was which was incredibly interesting. And he did make that statement and promise, and here he is delivering on it. So it's great to see that it's not always about party politics, and that it. I think it only helps our country, and I think even individually, when someone does that, it's only going to help someone like a Dave Sunday in the long term for wherever he goes in his career next, right? It shows that
I think that, and I think look, I think the future, my hope is, the future of American politics is not nearly as as divided as it's been, for the last, 15, 20 years. It's not just, we've had a situation where we've had, presidents that have been sort of lightning rods from both parties. And, you sort of hope that you can get back to a place where, centrism is recognized as the way to compromise.
Or it just acknowledging that the other side can actually be right about something. It's okay to agree with them. You don't have to just automatically give the stamp of approval or disapproval just because you disagree with or agree with the party as far as who you want to see in office. On that note, what was amazing today? Elizabeth Warren was on CNBC talking about tariffs and the economy. Probably no surprise where she came down on tariffs and disagreeing with most things from the Trump administration. but she actually acknowledged alignment with Trump, to her credit, on where she thinks interest rates should be going and what she's hoping that Fed Chairman Powell should be doing. She wants to see him lower interest rates just like Trump does. I think they both want to see them lowered for different reasons, right?
Right.
But they nonetheless have alignment. And to her credit, she said, "Yeah, I totally agree with President Trump and hopes to see interest rates go down."
Yeah,
So
it'll be interesting to see, that I would tell you, kind of looking into this crystal ball. So I wonder whether or not in the next few days the president seeks to actually fire the head of the Federal Reserve, which he doesn't really have the legal power to do because it's an independent agency.
right.
But he did fire two members of the FCC. And he did fire the head of the NLRB, and those cases are currently being litigated by the Supreme Court. He said something very ominous yesterday that his termination can't come soon enough, and the Federal Reserve chair is appointed by the president and can only be fired for cause. And so, but I think when I mean, other than the disruption it's going to have on the capital markets, I think I'm thinking this is the next shoe to drop.
Well, thankfully, the president's own Secretary of Treasury, Scott Bessent, has even strongly cautioned President Trump against taking such action. You could certainly debate the legal side of it. Is it legal for Trump to do it? And I think almost anybody, regardless of where you are in the political spectrum, would probably say no, unless you have the cause, and then it becomes debatable. Well, is there actual cause to fire him? But even the Secretary of Treasury, that is a Trump-appointed Secretary of Treasury, and he's taking a lot of guidance. President Trump is taking a lot of guidance from Secretary of Treasury Bessent, is coming down very firmly on his opinion of where this could potentially lead if Governor Powell was to be Fed Chairman Powell rather was to be replaced or fired.
I hear you, and I appreciate what the Treasury Secretary is saying. And we're 100 days in, and no cabinet secretary has been fired yet. So one of the lessons of the first 100 days is, the president does what the president wants to do, and whether it's attacking Harvard University, whether it's attacking major law firms, if you're not doing what he wants to do, he's found a way to come after you, and that is troubling. Because when we talk about court cases, you need lawyers to bring those court cases.
Yes.
And whether it's a liberal cause or a conservative cause, you need those people to help you.
Yeah, and everything's being weaponized, right? It's like, if you're not on my side, then I am going to annihilate and destroy you, right? It's complete, like, utter destruction. Which is scary, and I think you have a lot of people on the left that are scared of what's going on and the retaliation that's occurring, and then you have a lot of people on the right that are maybe like thankful or joyful to see some of this. It's a feeling like, oh, it's finally our turn to get a little bit of retribution, or like retaliatory acts that were maybe being done against the right. But I think if you take a step back, you don't want to see this done when your party is in power. You don't want to see these types of acts of aggression being done to the other side, the opposing party, because guess what? No party is going to be in power forever, right? I mean, right. I know people will say, oh, well, Trump's going to try to be in power forever and he's going to want to go for a third term. Regardless of that, Trump eventually will not be in office, whether he seeks a third term or not. And the Republican Party won't be in power, whether it's Trump or Vance or whomever, won't be in power forever. So you don't want to see retaliatory action done to Democrats. Just like when Democrats are in power, you don't want to see like any weaponization of any tool done to Republicans. So, again, it just speaks to like our where our country is headed with politics
Right.
and the polarization that's being done and why you ran as a forwardist, right? Because you wanted to see more moderate views and a third option for people. So, you know,
Yeah, no, I think you're right, and I think so. Let me sort of think. Let me share a story from last week. I was at an event for Colgate University where I'm an alumnus, and the president of Colgate was talking about the issues and how do you deal with this as a college president, and what his name is Brian Casey, very thoughtful, trained as a lawyer and then became an academic. He said, "Look, Colgate University has been in business for 213 semesters." You think about college presidents, think about things in semesters. He says, and we have 3 more semesters to go before the midterm elections, which is the next opportunity for Americans to go to the polls and say, you know what, we need to pause, or this is fine. Okay. And for those who are troubled by what's going on, that is the opportunity. And so when you think about it in those terms, it's like when you're making decisions about what you want to do about institutions and decisions that the president's making is this country's been here for almost 250 years. Next year is our sesquicentennial. And we've endured lots of different issues. And so, this too shall pass. But I think some of the things that are going on right now are troubling enough. And I think, Ray, to your point is that we want to have a system that's fair to everyone.
mhm.
And sometimes you win and sometimes you lose, but you don't have a system that is rigged in a way that is just frankly unconstitutional.
And a lot of these, you're talking about Colgate, your alma mater, and there are other schools that are being targeted. A lot of Ivy League schools that are being targeted with funding, and to their credit, they're taking a stand and saying, like as you said, this too shall pass. We've been here for a long time. What's and we, meaning those universities, are going to be here well long beyond like this administration and whatever administration comes next, and hopefully they're around for hundreds of years beyond our semi-quincentennial that is coming up next year. And what's interesting, I looked it up. There, as far as like signers of the Declaration of Independence, there were 9 from Princeton, there were 8 from Harvard, there were 5 from the University of Pennsylvania, 4 from Yale. Those are the biggest ones. 2 from King's College, which is now Columbia. But Princeton's at the very top with 9, and then just below is Harvard with 8. Right.
Right.
So here you have a school, Harvard, that's been around for a long time and formed this country, and now is being attacked by the current administration. And you can argue the merits of the attack and get into the nuance of it. But Harvard's going to be has been around for a long time and will continue to be around for a long time, just like Colgate. So
and they've been willing. And the thing about Harvard that I respect is, and I actually, when Harvard announced that they were fighting, I sent a note to Brian that says, so if we've been around for 213 semesters, Harvard's been around for 425 semesters.
Right.
But the idea that they're willing to stand up for the principles of free speech and a private university being able to operate, they want to operate, that I just have a lot of respect for that. And it is, they are being threatened by the loss of their tax exempt status. They are being threatened by the loss of funding. They are being threatened today by to lose the ability to bring in foreign students. And these are all significant impacts for a university like Harvard. But they're willing to stand up. And I think, frankly, by they standing up, it allows all the other universities, below them, because let's face it, Harvard is the preeminent university in our country. It makes everybody else sort of feel a little better that the head of the class has stepped up. And interestingly enough, in the law firm battles, where about half the law firms are fighting and about half the law firms are not, they have not shown the same spine that Harvard has. And so, as someone who got rejected like everybody else from Harvard, I still honor their talent and they're willing to fight. And look, at the end of the day, I think it's important to fight for the principles of freedom, regardless of how you process that freedom. That's what America is about. And what we're seeing lately is sort of attacks on that concept.
Yeah, and you were coming close to wrapping up here, and let's to kind of go back to one of our earlier topics. When you think about someone being deported, whether they're they have a green card, they're a U.S. citizen, and there's talk of maybe even sending the worst criminals that are U.S. citizens to an El Salvadorian jail, and finding loopholes to be able to do that. And it's easy to sit back and to think as like a U.S. citizen, well, you know what? I'm not a criminal. This doesn't impact me, and of course, I want to see these violent criminals like not out in society causing harm, and that we should deport them. It's easy to have that initial thought, but I think we have to think about the Pandora's box that could be opened here, and the rule of law. And that's kind of what we're talking about, is the rule of law and what that opens once these laws are ignored and process is ignored. If you'll allow me, I want to share a poem with our listeners, and a lot of people might be familiar with it as a good way to close, because this is a poem that's often cited as a powerful reminder of the dangers of apathy or silence in the face of injustice. And it's a poem that was by Pastor Martin, I hope I'm going to say his last name properly, Martin Niemöller, who was a German Luther pastor and theologian who initially supported Hitler, but later opposed the Nazi regime and was actually imprisoned in a concentration camp. And I know that's an extreme setting, but that extreme started with very small moves against the rule of law. And here's the poem. First, they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. So, I'm sure a lot of people have heard that before. If you haven't heard it before, let it resonate a little bit and think about what it means, because like we said, it's easy to think that some of these things don't matter and they don't impact all of us directly, and maybe they do, and these things that are going on right now do resonate with you a little bit more, but by not speaking out against them, we're doing as much of a disservice as some of the people that are maybe weaponizing some of these laws or twisting some of these laws. And whatever side of the fence you're on politically, just stop, take a moment, and think about how it could impact you when your party's not in power, and how it impacts our government more holistically. So with that, any closing remarks, Eric, before we?
No, I think that Pastor said it all. I think we're in a weird time, and I think we have to know that all of this does matter, and it's a privilege to be able to talk about it. And we hope you've enjoyed episode number 8 of Pinot and Policy. We hope to talk a little bit more about Pinot We'll see whether we can talk about French Pinot, but for now we're talking about policy. So I'm Eric Settle, and here with my co-host Rafe D'Amico. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Eric. Take care, everyone.